Brian here. Now, you might be surprised or possibly you're alarmed to see another John Cale video on my channel. I took some time for self-reflection and in the end decided to keep this going. Now, I will tell you about some feedback I received. So on previous videos, some commenters were very encouraging. Because I mentioned I might not continue with this, they encouraged me to continue because there's not a lot of John Cale information in the vinyl community. I don't think I've ever seen another person that I follow talk about John Cale, so that's interesting. There were some people who felt that maybe a video for every record was way too much and maybe it could be done more economically. But so I did take that into consideration. That's certainly a valid comment. And then there's a category of what I would call passive feedback, and that has to do with the fact that views and comments were not as high as for other videos I've done. And that could be that people who would normally comment skipped the John Cale videos, which is totally fine. I understand that. Ultimately, I think the vinyl community is a fairly self-indulgent place, and what could be more self-indulgent than making videos, perhaps even videos that few people will watch. So I decided, for whatever reason, to keep it going. For those reasons, really, not for whatever reasons. I decided to keep it going and see where it takes us. So let's talk about Fear, released October 1st, 1974. This is John Cale's fourth solo record. Now, of course, he released other things and was involved in other projects, but this is his fourth record attributed just to John Cale. And this, for me, heralds the onset of what I think is John Cale's best period, really. It's kind of an astonishing period because this was released in October 1974, and within a year and a half after this, he had released three brilliant records, sometimes called the Island Years or the Island Trilogy. They're all great, and they're quite different from what came before it. You know, we had the experimental stuff, we had the classical stuff, we had the pop record, we had Paris 1919, which came before this. So let's take a minute to differentiate this or discuss this in the context of Paris 1919, because that was a Baroque pop album. It has strings, it's very lush, orchestral. It's short too, it's only around 30 minutes. This is almost 41 minutes, and it's really the opposite in many ways. There's in-your-face guitars. For example, there's a different kind of vocal approach, I would say, in some of the tracks. So this starts his legendary Island Years trilogy. I would say that the sound he achieved on the next three records is quite different. It's edgier, especially on this record we have, maybe it's ahead of his time. It's chaotic in places. It's abrasive in places. It is maybe to some people not as accessible as other records. And there's certain hints at violence in the music, which might seem like a weird thing to say. And I think we should also remember that Cale was going into his period of drug addiction here. So dark lyrics as well, all very interesting. Now, another thing to point out is that at this time he was producing Patti Smith's Horses, so he was well aware of the New York City punk scene. Not to say that this is a punk-sounding record. I don't think it is, but there may be some symmetry there with what he was hearing. John Cale plays keyboards, guitar, and bass, and he's joined by Phil Manzanera on guitar. And by the way, the opening music to this video was a portion of one of the solos on a track called Gun by Phil Manzanera. We'll talk about that later. Archie Leggett on bass, we got Fred Smith on drums, and we have Brian Eno doing Brian Eno-ish things. Plus we have Richard Thompson appears on a track, and some other people. So this is a rock record, just to be clear. It's not those other experiments he was doing. I don't think it's fair to call it pop. It's a rock record. And what else can I say in terms of background? That's probably it. So less lush, more chaotic. Let's put it that way. So let's talk about the songs. I'm not going to go through them in huge detail, but I wanted to say something about each of them. It starts off with a track called Fear is a Man's Best Friend. The album's called Fear. I guess as close as we get to a title track, Fear is a Man's Best Friend. And it starts with a very nice piano line. There's guitar in it. There's a bit of strings, I think. And I think there's strings. I'm not actually sure about that. I should check. But as the song goes through, it ends in almost what you describe as chaos, because the song becomes, the instrumentation becomes louder and more, chaos is the only word I can think of. It's almost violent in his way, the way he approaches the instruments. It's this sort of this aggression. So discordant maybe is another word that we could use to describe it. So it lurches towards that kind of discordant, lurches towards that discordant, chaotic, maybe violent ending, which is not what you'd expect when you first hear the track. It kind of goes off the rails. A passive listener would think, what happened there? Like, why is it going off the rails like that? And then the lyrics themselves are quite dark. He talks about, like, one of the lines is, darkness warmer than a bedroom floor, want someone to hold me close forevermore. The refrain is, safe fear is a man's best friend. You add it up, it brings you down. He's talking about being on the prowl and you better run like hell. So not easy to discern what's going on, and why is fear a man's best friend is a good question, but it's a really interesting track. And it ends in that kind of loud cacophony almost, and then kind of peters out. And surprisingly, the next track is a very beautiful melodic piece of music, which don't seem to go together, but it kind of works. Number 2 is a track called Buffalo Ballet. And I'd say it's one of Cale's best songs. It is absolutely beautiful. Cale has a real talent for melody. I think he nails it on many of these tracks. They're just beautiful melodies. This one definitely has strings. It's acoustic. There's a guitar, and it has a story that you can follow along to, which I think is really great. His lyrics aren't always easy to understand, but that's probably a case of a pretty clear one. And from there we go to Barracuda, which I think would have made a good single, but it wasn't released as a single. They released a kind of a curious song as a single, which we will come to. But Barracuda is one of my favorite tracks on the record. It's a good rock song. It has a good propulsive kind of component to it. Great use of the viola. If you were listening to it casually, you might think it's a guitar, but no, it's a viola. Probably maybe one of the most accessible tracks on it. It's a fun track. It's upbeat. It's really cool. But again, the lyrics are really dark. And I'm going to reference a few of them here. So, dark woman in the water drowning, sinking in a funny way. Black footing for a face exploding, mimicking our final days. Throughout the song, he sings, the ocean will have us all, over and over again, which I assume is a reference to the fact that we're all going to die. Dark woman in a cupboard burning. Woman, what have they done? Dark woman like a panther breathing. Woman, what can be done? We've got cold cost of the death of nothing, slipping just like nothing did. Burnt scarecrow and the wind was choking, smoking in the summer heat. 10 morons with their whistles blowing, howling like a winter gale. Dark woman like a cow crowing. A crow crowing. Crowing for the carrion meat. We have dark forest with the moon arising, smiling at you out of reach. Cracked window in the chapel dreaming, hoping while they drain them each. I don't know what these necessarily mean, but it's a really engaging song with dark, dark lyrics.
Barracuda, Barracuda, won't you lay down your life for me? Won't you love me, Barracuda, if you always keep bring out the worst in me?
Now, the next two tracks are kind of, I think the first time I heard it, and I can't remember when that was, were kind of off-putting because we have this nice propulsive rock song called Barracuda, and then we get Emily, which is the calmest song on the record. It starts with the sound of an ocean and pianos and this lush atmospheric track about loss, and John Cale singing about maybe we'll love again. Maybe it's about remorse. It's really unlike most of the other tracks. I'd say unlike all the other tracks on the record. Really good though. Ship of Fools, I would say, is kind of a surreal track because the lyrics are just bizarre. He mentions Garnet, Wales, which is his hometown, and of course he referred to Wales in an interview I read somewhere as a coffin, or maybe that was in his autobiography. He goes to, in the song they go to Memphis and Tombstone. He mentions Dracula, very odd song, but actually really great. The melody is also great. On side 2, we start with a track called Gun, which is, to my mind, the centerpiece of the record. It's over 8 minutes long. It, I would say, makes one think of the Velvet Underground, because if you think of tracks like Sister Ray, that's sort of epic song that never ends, seems to never want to end. It's lots of instrumental breaks. That's kind of the feeling you get from this song. It is a tour de force. I mean, it's probably closer to the Velvet Underground than anything he had done to this point. Maybe. I mean, that might be saying too much, but in any case, there are some really interesting guitar solos from Phil Manzanera, and apparently what happened is Brian Eno was feeding Manzanera's guitar solos through some sort of synth system in real time and feeding it back into whatever recording system they were using. So that's what Brian Eno was doing. Really interesting. And I think the first time I heard it, I thought, well, that's all, will it ever end? But now I wish it was longer. It just has this thing you want it to keep going. It's really great. I should have mentioned some of the lyrics, but this probably be too long to do that. Now, the next track is kind of weird because it was released as a single, and for the life of me, I can't figure out why anyone would release this track as a single, partly because of the subject matter. It's called The Man Who Couldn't Afford to Orgy, but when John Cale sings it, he sings The Man Who Couldn't Afford to Orgy. I don't know why he uses the hard G. It's kind of curious. A funny song. I would say this is the most salacious song, but the funniest song. It's just wacky, and it features companion vocals by someone called Judy Nylon, who was the person referenced back in Judy's Jungle, the Brian Eno track. So she sings this kind of like these seductive lines throughout the song, which are really cool. It's kind of I guess you'd say a sexy song, I suppose, but it's just like the man who couldn't afford to orgy. I mean, pity this man, pity that man, he couldn't afford to orgy. Yeah, it is a pity, I suppose. But why they released it as a single, I'll never know. And the flip side was Sylvia Said, which showed up on a later compilation. But a really good song. I mean, the melody in that song is terrific. The piano in that song is really great. Probably the most bizarre single to be issued. I don't know why.
Pity the poor man, pity the sad man, pity the green man who couldn't afford to orgy. Pity the policeman, pity the snowman, pity the woman who couldn't afford to orgy.
Say, Charlie, you all in your lonesome? Come on, baby, let me show you.
Good for the postman, good for the con man, good for the milkman, they can afford to orgy. Good for the butcher, good for the astronaut, good for the curate, they can afford to orgy.
Come on, honey, you keep breaking my heart. You're breaking my heart.
Know More Than I Know is a pleasant melodic song, which I never really thought too much about the lyrics, but it's a beautiful song.
You know more than I know. You know more than I know. You know more than I know.
And at this point, I was, in the record, you're thinking there's this kind of almost a balance between the sort of louder, aggressive songs and the more melodic songs, which I think is fair enough. There's about 50-50-ish or so. And this is one of the more melodic ones. And it ends with a more energizing song called Mo Mama Scuba, which features Richard Thompson on slide guitar. And it has, it's just a good rock song, as good as Barracuda, perhaps. And it has a really excellent bass line, too.
Scuba woman, dive me slow. Scuba woman, dive me low. Love ya, skin ya, dive me slow. Pull me slow and dive me down. Take me with you, dive me down.
It rounds it out, and I think of the 9 tracks. So there's 9 tracks, and I think they're all great. But thinking about the record, I was thinking, how do you actually summarize what this record is? Because it's kind of two things at once. And so before this video, I looked it up on AllMusic to see what they said, because sometimes I agree with AllMusic and sometimes I don't. But the quote is, "This record runs the gamut of abrasive rock, beautiful ballads, subversive sleaziness, and with a dollop of unhinged dementia thrown in for good measure." And that's actually, I can't think of a better way to describe this record. It is all of those things. And in my scale of how I would rank this, I'd say this is essential. This is an essential John Cale record. You can't possibly be interested in John Cale without having heard this. And I would go farther and say that if you were a fan of 70s rock, if that's your thing, then you owe yourself a listen to this record, because it's not like it's unheralded. People love this record. It's just not as well known as it should be, and that's a shame, because I think this should be in everyone's rock collection. If you're a 1970s rock fan, this should be in your collection. I think it's really good, and it's essential for me. So part 8 will come, I suppose, at some time, unless I change my mind. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.